Good evening, everyone. My name is Twele. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Holy Family Catholic Church in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Thank you for being here live and for watching on our YouTube channel for the first in a two-part series of explainer events. This is an ongoing series, an occasional but ongoing series that we do at Holy Family when some current event issue comes up in the life of the church, or some surprising and unexpected thing comes from the Vatican, like our first session was. We take an opportunity, we take a few weeks for the newness to sink in, and then I here at the parish present about an hour-long explainer event to set up where this particular idea has come from, what the main points of it are, how it's been reported in Catholic media and in secular media, whether that was fair or unfair, how it affects the daily life here at Holy Family Parish, and ways for our members to think about taking the meat of this new thing or this idea in Catholic teaching and apply it more deeply to their own lived faith life. And in that spirit, our two-part series here in September 2024 is some, can't do all, but at least some, principles of voting as a Catholic Christian. No matter when you are watching this, right now we're doing the video because November of 2024 is close upon us. Early voting begins in just a few weeks. Absentee ballots will be going out in the mail soon, so this is a great time for Catholic voters to start thinking about how they're going to make the decision that's in front of them. And today and next week, I've chosen just a small number of resources that Rome has given us and that the U.S. Conference of Bishops has given us to think about how a Catholic considers issues of human dignity and issues of how they are going to apply the social teachings of the church and the principles of the social doctrine of the church to the choice that they have in front of them in November. And so I've chosen two texts, one for this week that comes very recently, earlier this calendar year, from the Vatican, and one for next week from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that look at the aspects of Catholic social teaching, first surrounding the dignity of the human person, and second, 7 guiding principles of Catholic social teaching and how they have in the past decade or so applied to current United States moral issues, political issues, and how to use those principles and apply them in your voting future. Now, what that means is that there's lots of things that this series isn't. It is not, first and foremost, instructions on how a Catholic ought to vote, or which principles a Catholic ought to hold higher than others, and to guide their voting deliberations. This is not a declaration of a Catholic must vote in such or such a way, or they should not consider themselves really living up to their identity as a Catholic Christian. That's not what we're doing here. Nor is this a praise or a critique of any current in the year 2024 political party or individual politician, no matter what office they're running for. No, we're not. Whether it's a major party, minor party, that is not what this is. Though it is being recorded in September 2024, it is not intended to apply exclusively to this calendar year or exclusively to the parties and politicians who are in the news at the time of this filming. It is also not a position statement by us as Holy Family Parish, by our pastor, Reverend Ryan Elder, by anyone on the staff. It is not a statement of Holy Family endorses or rejects these particular partisan or political stances in the year 2024. We are not taking sides. We are not meant to take sides. We are not allowed by our bishop to take sides. We give moral guidance. We state the principles of the church, and we give indications on how to apply them in the current situation, but we don't influence the voting deliberations of our parishioners or anyone else. That is not our mission. And for those of you here in person, this isn't a registration drive either. I will mention the early voting schedule at the end of next session as we send you off to do your voting deliberations. But this is not even specifically tied to vote in November 2024. This is really meant to be a resource for many years in the future as well. So what is this series after all? The series is an overview of Catholic principles, as I said, on the fundamental principle of individual human dignity and the 7 guiding principles of Catholic social doctrine. It is an overview. It does not claim to be exhaustive. That wouldn't be possible in just 2-hour-long sessions. It is an opportunity to give Catholic voters information about resources that are out there, and again, only a small selection of resources, but fairly recent ones, for studying in greater detail than I can give you in these 2 videos, what those principles of Catholic social teaching are. And in some of the resources that I provide to our live audience and that I will show momentarily on the PowerPoint, you can go into much greater detail and see an argument much more fully laid out about the principles that I will be summarizing in just a sentence or 2 in tonight's presentation. It is an opportunity for us to evaluate issues that are current events in the mid-2020s right now. Issues, not specific partisan stances on how to address the issue, but the issue itself, the moral question involved itself, and to evaluate those moral questions of the here and now in light of the Catholic principles that I will introduce you to and provide you with resources to study more on your own. And finally, for those who are here with us live, there is a question and answer opportunity. If you are watching us on the video, please feel free to drop comments, not partisan comments, please, not specifically about anything happening in election year 2024, if you can, but comments about the principles enunciated here and the resources and the application to current issues. And someone from Holy Family, most likely myself, will be only too happy to reply to those comments and have a form of this conversation going on online as well. To that end, if any of you are watching now, in the week between September 11th and 18th, 2024, and would like to submit a question currently about current events that are major voting issues, in the hopes that I can incorporate some of that into the second part of this series on September 18th, you may follow the QR code that is on the screen right now. A link, a URL to the Google form will be provided in the description of the YouTube video as well. And you can submit questions to a completely anonymous question and answer file, a Google form that allows you to submit questions and indicate that you are asking this as part of the Catholic voting explainer item that we are doing at Holy Family. And I will do my best for those that I received before, up to September 17th, to incorporate them in the talk that I give on the 18th. Otherwise, that form is always open And please feel free to continue at any time on any Catholic issue using that form to submit questions that we might make a future video to answer. So the plan, as I have already sort of hinted at, is this. Today we are looking at a document that is from Rome, and you can tell because it has a Latin title, Dignitas Infinita. Those of you who are here live and in person have a copy of it for you to take home. In front of you on the table. A link to the Vatican website where you can find it will also be posted as well. And this is about the forms of human dignity and current moral issues considered in relation to that principle of human dignity. Next week we will be guided by the U.S. Bishops' Conference document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, which those of you who attend live next week will also be provided with a copy of, in which the U.S. bishops lay out the principles of Catholic social teaching and the principles of how we go about forming our moral conscience to approach the moral issues of our day and discern for each of us individually how we ought to cast our votes about them. This is one of the various forms in which Dignitas Infinita has been published. The image of it is just a book cover. The Declaration on Human Dignity, Dignitas Infinita, was released just earlier this year, April 2nd, not specifically by Pope Francis himself, but by an office within the Vatican called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is responsible for putting out instructions and declarations to clarify some aspect of Catholic theology or moral practice as it is current in the global Catholic situation. It does not have the same kind of weight in terms of longevity or application through the centuries that something like an encyclical by a pope or a constitution from one of the great councils of bishops from around the world might have, but it is something that Pope Francis looks at and approves and reflects the tenor of Pope Francis's teaching and indications on how it can be applied in the here and now. And that is going to be the focus of today's video. Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship has not been fully updated by the U.S. bishops since 2015. So there are some hot button issues in 2024 that won't be covered. Many of them, in fact, are addressed because they're happening all over the world in today's session. But certainly the principles of how you form your conscience to make moral judgments, and many of the issues that were live in 2015 are no less live now. So that will be the September 18th video. And if you want to go deeper on any of the particular principles at hand, this book is now about 20 years old. It comes from another office in the Vatican called the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. This compendium of the social doctrine of the Church reads almost exactly like the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It is much shorter. It's only about, though it doesn't look like it here, it's only about a fifth of the length of the Catechism, in terms of the number of paragraphs at least. But it goes systematically through all of the philosophical, theological, and moral, societal, anthropological foundations of Catholic social teaching in a very organized and schematic way. I'm in the process of working up some summary videos that I would just record in my office and then post. They wouldn't be part of a live explainer event. But I am working on making some summary videos of the compendium book as well, that can also join these videos on the YouTube channel and contribute an even fuller overview of all of the various social issues that the Church feels it has something to say about. All right. Now on to Dignitas Infinita. This is the Vatican text that came out in April of this year. In paragraph 1, Dignitas Infinita lays out its fundamental position about the principle of human dignity. And hopefully it's not a surprise to hear that the Catholic Church holds that every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being. This principle underlies the primacy of the human person and the protection of human rights. So there is no cavilling, there is no wishy-washiness about the Church's position that every single human being, regardless of any circumstance of their life, by virtue of being a human being, possesses a dignity that cannot be measured against anyone else's and cannot be stolen away or lost. It is proper to the human person that the human person is infinitely dignified. Why should that be? And why should it be that the Church, here in the year 2024, sees an opportunity to proclaim anew its conviction that all human beings, all created by God, and all redeemed by Christ, at least in the offer that Christ makes of redemption, must be recognized and treated with respect and love due to this inalienable dignity. We have a little bit of legwork to go through before the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith gets around to telling us exactly what the foundations of human dignity are, but it's hinted at here already, the fact that God is directly the creator of the human soul, that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God, that God is directly involved in the creation of every person, that God is directly involved in the sustaining of every human person, in the spiritual development of every human person, and that God loves every human person. Now, dignity is a tough concept. Not tough because we doubt whether humans have dignity, at least in principle, but tough because dignity can mean so many different things in the common usage of the word in various societies and various circumstances. And Dignitas Infinita itself breaks down the principle of fundamental human dignity into 4 aspects or modes or angles of looking at it. The first one that it addresses is ontological dignity. This is the one that we've been talking about thus far. Because we exist, because God willed us to exist and created us so that we might exist and loves us throughout our existence, we have a dignity that is conditioned on nothing else than our being human and our being in existence. It is unerasable and it is valid beyond all circumstances of our lives. There is another concept that the text here identifies as moral dignity, and this is dignity as we express our humanity through the free choices that we make. This is the kind of dignity that we demonstrate that we have, the way we model the dignity that we possess as human beings, and our awareness of being willed, created, and loved by God through the way we behave and interact with others in the world. This is a kind of dignity that, and the text puts this in inverted commas too, may be lost. This is the kind of dignity that if we form badly our moral conscience, as we will talk about next next week, or if we fail to follow our moral conscience, or if we simply make free choices to act in violence, act in hatred, act in injustice, or any of the other ways that we show disregard for our own dignity and the dignity of those around us, we seem in the eyes of the world, we seem in the eyes of our fellow Christians who are trying to follow their consciences and form them well, to be acting undignifiedly, to have lost, to have set aside, to have wasted our ontological dignity that we have just by existing. And this only highlights, the text is clear to say, the importance that all of us live our own Christian witness in a morally upstanding way. To show others what a dignified life of an infinitely dignified person really can look like, and to persuade them by the conduct of our life to seek to build their moral dignity back. It's not going to come from anyone else. I mean, God could choose to intervene in some extraordinary way, but normally, we are the ones who model the love of God in the world. And so moral dignity is an obligation that each of us has upon ourselves to, as 2 Peter says, act in a way worthy of our vocation to be members of the church and children of God. The text also looks at social dignity, which is the quality of a person's societal existence, and whether that is dignified and befitting of human life or not, the quality of a person's living conditions. There are many kinds of living conditions, like extreme poverty, that simply are undignified. The human being is worth more and deserves more, and their dignity demands that they be treated with more than their societal situation currently has available to them, or that they are able to access. This is a contradiction of the inalienable dignity that people possess, but it comes by way of societal structures, more than the individual good or bad example of individual human actors. And then there's existential dignity. This is all of those other sort of intangibles. Well, some of them are very tangible, but in a general sense, intangibles that we consider when we are evaluating our own life and saying, am I living with dignity right now? Is my life dignified? And this can include our psychological state, whether we are mentally at peace, whether we are able to feel a sort of consistent sense of joy, whether we are able to live in hope, or whether we are feeling very seriously tempted towards despair or instability. This includes chronic illness. This includes the peace of our domestic life, whether there is violence in our family, generation above, below, or the one we're in, amongst our family members. This includes addictions or very difficult medical situations that we happen to be in that are really hampering our ability to make full use of our capacity for action in the world, our capacity to live a Christian witness. This is all covered under the heading of existential dignity, and it is a great source of suffering and a great source of injustice for an individual human person who is aware of their great dignity to yet live in this state of disconnect between the true dignity that they have and the perceived dignity that they feel they're able to reach this much and no more. But really, all four of these aspects of human dignity are one. We are all called to live the ontological dignity that we possess by virtue of being humans, created, willed, and loved by God, at the moral level by the free choices that we make, and at the existential level to the extent that it is in our power to do anything about, for example, our psychological or addictive state, to live that in the way we perceive our dignity and the way we strive to exercise our dignity through the particular life situation that we are in, through all of those intangibles. Ontological dignity, of course, is something that a person never loses. We can't say this often enough. It cannot be lost. No one ever truly gives it up or has it taken away from them, ontologically as our being human. It is something that can, in the moral sense or in the existential sense, can grow and mature. A person's dignity, if the life of that person is lived, guided by the Holy Spirit, involved in a life of prayer, involved in receiving the teachings of the church, can deepen, can expand, can continue to develop and flourish. By extension, it can also be left to wither on the vine if someone does not take care to cultivate the living of their dignity. Each person, therefore, must strive to live up to the full measure of their dignity to the extent that they are able, and societal conditions provide them with the option and the possibility to do so. The question of sin might rightly be raised here when someone sacrifices, in a sense, or gives up their moral dignity by committing sin. What does that have any knockoff effect, for example, on any other aspect of their human dignity? And yes, sin wounds our moral dignity. It can hide, it can obscure, it can cast a shadow over our ontological dignity because we are not living the dignified status that we rightly possess, to be sure. It can express in its own way the social dignity in which a person was living that inspired them or coerced them or led them in some way to sin. It can express the disconnect between one's true dignity and one's existential sense of their dignity. But it can never cancel the fact that every person is created in God's image and likeness, willed by God and loved by God. Sin doesn't dehumanize us in the eyes of God. It may dehumanize us in the eyes of others, but it does not undignify us in the eyes of the God who created and willed and loved us. That is simply not possible. We are not going to give short shrift by any means to the biblical perspective that Dignitas Infinita offers on how it is that our human dignity is demonstrated through salvation history and through the testimony of Scripture, that it really does have its ultimate roots in God. And these slides themselves are a significant editing down, abridgment of everything that the text of Dignitas Infinita has to offer. But we might note that the God of the Old Testament, which is not different from the God of the New Testament, but shall we say then God in the Old Testament, is deeply concerned for the social welfare of his people. The very first chapter of Genesis tells us why. He created mankind in his image. When Moses hears the voice of God in the burning bush, what does God say? He says, I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt, and their suffering under their taskmasters. I know well what they are suffering. God is aware at all times of the undignified situation that his people may be in. At Mount Sinai, once we get past the Ten Commandments and start explaining out what the law of God requires for the people of Israel, there are explicit commandments. You shall not oppress or afflict a foreigner, a resident alien. You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If you lend to the poor, you must do it with no demand for interest, or else you are, in a sense, robbing them. The prophets pulled no punches either. The prophet Amos, perhaps the earliest in life, in chronology of the Old Testament prophets, certainly came out swinging against the rulers of Judah, claiming that God, for 3 crimes and for 4, will not overlook the sins of his people because they hand over the poor for a pair of sandals. They force the lowly out of the way. They oppress the just. They accept bribes. They turn away the needy at the gate. Clear at the other end of the wisdom literature that post-dates the Jewish people's return from exile, the book of Sirach, just perhaps the second latest book of the Old Testament to come before the lifetime of Jesus himself, synthesizes all of this in claims that, for example, the bread of charity is life itself for the needy. Whoever withholds it is a murderer. Whoever chooses not to exercise charity towards the poor and needy when they could do so, and know they could do so, is imposing a kind of death on those poor and needy. To take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deny a laborer wages is to shed blood. From the beginning to the end, this message permeates the Old Testament, and Jesus is no stranger to it either. We need only take a brief moment to remember the parable of the sheep and the goats at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, just before the Passion, in which famously the Lord comes down and judges humanity, putting the sheep on the right and the goats on the left, and welcoming the sheep into the kingdom, preparing for them since the foundation of the world, precisely because whenever they fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, tended the sick, or visited the imprisoned, they were doing it for him as well. Jesus has, in a mystical sense, an even stronger presence among the poor and needy than he does among those with a stable life. Paul is no different from Jesus on this point. Paul is one along with Jesus. Jesus, who gives us the 2 great commandments: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Paul comes to this in his own way as well. The one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments are summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no evil to a neighbor, and therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. So, not only from a philosophical position about our human dignity, but also from the testimony of voices clear through Holy Scripture from the beginning to the end, we are encouraged, we are obligated morally to seek the dignity not only of ourselves, but of our human brothers and sisters. Dignitas Infinita condenses this into 3 central convictions. First, where the dignity of the person comes from, Creator God. How human dignity was revealed in its fullness through the taking on human life of Jesus, and Jesus living through every aspect of it, including tremendous poverty. And third, that because humans are destined for an eternal life, a perpetual vision face to face of God, that at the very end of time will encompass not only our soul, but soul and body together, that human dignity is inseparably linked to our ultimate end, our final purpose. If you, in the video, have questions to submit about the biblical perspective or those three convictions, by all means, include them in the comments and I will have a look. Now, what is the list of current situations in which human dignity is violated that Dignitas Infinita presents to us? I have not left out any of the social issues that the text addresses, but I have often condensed 3 paragraphs of insight into a moral issue into 1 or 2 pithy full sentences from the text. So by all means, please follow the link to the full text of Dignitas Infinita on the Vatican website, so that using the paragraph references in the heading of each slide, you can take a look in more detail at what Pope Francis's Office of the Doctrine of the Faith has to say about each one. So, unsurprisingly, Dignitas Infinita begins with poverty, which has already been, through the biblical evidence and through the discussion of the 4 aspects of human dignity, a lead, a guiding thread through the whole thing. The dignity of the poor is denied in 2 ways. A poor person is having the expression of their human dignity denied in 2 ways. Not only because they lack the resources to meet their basic needs, and social structures are not making those resources available to them, but also by the indifference of those who could give, whether from their excess or to make a small sacrifice of their own for the poor and needy. This is another place, and for every one of these, I could give this disclaimer, so I'm going to give it once at the beginning. This does not instruct a Catholic on what the ideal or preferred or most appropriate method of giving of your excess, of your surplus, or making your sacrifice from what you could do with a little bit less of and tighten the belt but still get by for the poor. It is not an instruction on whether to do giving directly to panhandlers or give to a Catholic charity or volunteer your time or advocate with county or state advocacy groups. It gives no instruction on that, and it doesn't mean to. The way you commit yourself to this principle that the poor deserve to have their dignity affirmed, both by having the resources that they need to survive and by knowing that their neighbors recognize their dignity and want to see them exalted. How you do that is to your own discernment, but the principle is unchanging. The next one is war. It should go without saying that all wars contradict the principle of human dignity, at the very least, because if human dignity comes from our being created, willed, and loved by God and is built into our human life, then we should have our entire natural human life to express that dignity and to recognize it and to glory in it. And if war does anything, it shortens prematurely the lives of dignified people. And especially when civilians are involved. Especially in wars that do not discriminate as neatly as they could, perhaps, between whether the targets and the victims of their weapons and their attacks are combatants or not, whether they are adults or children, whether they are healthy or sick. That kind of indiscriminate loss of life in war is especially to be loathed and avoided. Globally, migration and the difficulties that migrants face and the injustices that they suffer come into Dignitas Infinita as well. And on this, the text dares us to agree with it, I would say. No one will ever openly deny that migrants are human beings. Yet in practice, by our decisions and the way we treat them, we can show that we consider them less worthy, less important, less human. In the year 2024, this is not exclusively about the border between the United States and Mexico. In Pope Francis's mind, it is just as much about Northern African and Middle Eastern and even Sub-Saharan African migration up into Europe and the extremely perilous crossings of the Mediterranean Sea that they have to go through. Closely connected to this, because many migrants are forced into this situation to get where they're trying to go, is the scourge of human trafficking, which again denies human dignity in a twofold way. By disfiguring the humanity of the victim, treating them as a commodity, treating them as something to be bought, sold, and traded, to be handled like cattle or worse, but also dehumanizes the traffickers, turns the traffickers themselves into people unaware, deliberately forgetting that they share a dignity with others, and that it is incumbent on them to protect their own dignity through respecting and upholding the dignity of others. That is the end of the sort of foreign policy aspect. So I might introduce another question in next session right here before we get into domestic and household abuses of human dignity to see if there are questions. Seeing none, we'll move on. All right, on the home front, as it were, there is, of course, the violation of human dignity, that is sexual abuse. And 22 years on now from the bombshell revelations about the Archdiocese of Boston, from the New York Times, as memorialized in the movie Spotlight, as many of us will remember right now, those of us who are watching this, the church has more than its fair share of atoning to do for the existence of abusers and incidents of abuse within the church family itself, within the relationship between priests and their flock, shepherds and their flock priests and their faithful. And so, Dignitas Infinita owns this and declares quite openly that the church ceaselessly ought to exert itself to put an end to all kinds of abuse, starting from within, and recognizes fully that sexual abuse wounds the human dignity, the existential dignity, we might say, if we wanted to assign it one aspect, of those who suffer it. And it would not be a far cry to say that just like human trafficking, sexual abuse also dehumanizes the abuser, who is not only treating the person he abuses as an object to be used and enjoyed and discarded, but treats himself as an object to enjoy itself and move on without any kind of dedication or commitment to a life of dignity to share with another person. Violence against women, of course, happens not only in matters of sexual abuse. It occurs in physical forms, in forms of harassment, in forms of the pay gap, in forms of restricted access to social life. And Dignitas Infinita does not limit this to those countries that, for example, legally forbid women to own property or to run businesses or to leave the house alone, but in even the most democratic countries. The concrete social reality testifies to the fact that women are often not accorded the same dignity as men. And so the text calls us to give a special concern that the dignity between the sexes is recognized and respected and given its full egalitarianism that it deserves. The Church's position on abortion should not by now be a surprise. It is firmly against. Unborn children are the most defenseless and innocent among us. Efforts are made to deny them their human dignity and to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this. This includes, in a sort of tangential, sideways way, not a phrase that, to my recollection, Dignitas Infinita specifically invokes, though we will see it next week, but considers as part of the abortion economy, in a sense, which is all of the fertilized embryos that are created by artificial insemination and are frozen or are stored away, possibly to be implanted into a woman who may or may not have had anything to do with their creation. Usually, yes, frequently, yes, but depending on the agreement that a woman makes, not necessarily. And then some are thawed and discarded, some remain in this sort of limbo, and they are, again, treated as goods and services to be bought, sold, and traded in. And so I think to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this, refers not only to the individual conversation between a woman, a doctor, the father of the child, and the medical or chemical procedures used, interventions used in that form of abortion, but also for the sort of passive abortions that occur when embryos are created and then left to do nothing, to have no future. And another reason that I think IVF is implicated here is because surrogacy, for maybe the first time in a formal official Vatican document, gets its own call-out. That the practice, not just of women having multiple fertilized embryos produced and then put in storage, but the practice of a woman offering her body or being paid or invited or influenced to donate the use of her body to raise someone else's child violates a right that the child has to be born in a human way, being a human being. So cyborgism would also be implicated by this principle, that we are not to artificialize ourselves, and we are not to artificialize others in any really defining form. And that begins at the very beginning of human life. It also violates the dignity of the woman, who becomes a means subservient to the gain or desire of others, regardless of whether she consents. She may not act in a subservient way. A family may involve the surrogate mother greatly. They may have a close relationship throughout the pregnancy. They may continue to involve the woman in the life of the child that is born, even after the child has to be handed over to the parents that arranged for the pregnancy. But it is a commercial exchange. It is using a human being as part of a process at the end of which someone else gets what they want. That is what is meant here by means to an end, subservient to the gain or desire of others. Dignitas Infinita also finally says, the desire to have a child, legitimate, absolutely legitimate, can never bleed over into a conviction that we have a right to have children. If every human being is created by God, willed by God, it is not ours to say, I am going to acquire a child, naturally or artificially. It isn't ultimately ours to decide. It isn't ours to claim as though we were making ourselves the God of our future generations' life. At the other end of human life, euthanasia and assisted suicide utilizes a mistaken understanding of human dignity to turn the concept of dignity against life itself. We can talk about existential dignity and that awareness that some of us may have that our lives are not reaching, not expressing the dignity that we as humans inalienably possess. And our lives may never be able to express that in its fullness, interpersonally, socially. But since the ontological dignity of our life as being created, willed, and loved by God cannot be taken away from us, cannot be lost. And as we saw, existential dignity is that aspect by which we see the disconnect between our true and our perceived dignity. And social dignity is that aspect in which we see whether one's living conditions allow them to manifest their innate dignity. That dignity remains and is permanent. And so, to claim that existential dignity, what we perceive as our dignified life, actually determines whether we have our true and innate dignity. And if we don't perceive it, it is perfectly legitimate to cast it off, to act like we already don't have it and act accordingly, is deeply wrong. And it is offense against life and an offense against dignity itself. Suffering does not cause the sick to lose their ontological dignity. And in many cases, it does not cause them to lose that moral dignity that they exercise by their free choices either. Dignity is to be considered in such a more encompassing and overarching way than just do we feel that our quality of life expresses who we're meant to be? Valid though that is, and legitimate a concern though that is, it is not definitive of dignity itself. And therefore, euthanasia and assisted suicide, once again, encourage one to make oneself the god of their life and the god of others' lives. In this case, often the lives of the generation above them. Marginalization of the disabled, those with disabilities, every effort should be made to encourage the inclusion and active participation of those who are affected by frailty or disability in the life of society. This affects the social and existential dignity of everyone in between beginning of life issues and end of life issues, in the way that they live out, in the circumstances of their body, the innate dignity that they possess. And then gender theory and sex change, both offenses against human dignity. This is another place where I will remind you the text of Dignitas Infinita is much more detailed and longer and more argued out than this presentation is able to say. So please have a look at the link to see the full explanation that the text gives. Here, I can only give one sentence for each of them. That to me seems to encompass the argument in one neat package. That gender theory, and here we mean one's attempt to redefine the maleness or femaleness of their social role, their existential self-awareness, the circumstances within which they have free choices to make morally. Desiring a personal self-determination, apart from the fundamental truth that human life, which is both spiritual and physical, because the human person is a composite of body and soul, and it is that united body and soul that is human nature and that possesses human dignity. Apart from the fundamental truth that that is a gift, to seek that level of self-determination is conceding, as I have said several times now, to the temptation to make oneself God. Sex change, in which one goes so far as to alter the body that they were born with, to make physiological changes, to express themselves as a body of the other sex, is an offense against human dignity, because our bodies participate in our human dignity as being sexed as male or female, along with every other aspect of our body that could be as minimal as blue eyes or brown eyes, blonde hair or black hair, or as central as male or female. Our body participates in that dignity, and that dignity involves our interrelationship, our communion with others, and going all the way back to Adam and Eve and the institution of human relationships, men and women establishing loving relationships capable of generating other persons. So, again, this is not the kind of text that will break apart the psychological motivation in various approaches or various conditions in which one might seek to redefine their gender, redetermine it, or to change their bodily sex, at least in its outward presentation. The text isn't meant to be long and exhaustive like that, but the principle here is enunciated. Our bodies, as male or female, are part of our human person, part of our human nature, participate in our human dignity in an inseparable way from the dignity of our soul as being created by God directly. And therefore, it is not in our hands to determine whether our dignity would be better expressed if the body of our human person were to be other than it is. The last one, finally, quite a long list, and here we have come to the last one, also new in Vatican texts, digital violence. This includes harassment, bullying, this includes theft of income, this includes identity fraud, this includes those sorts of hacks that take down financial systems, take down cybersecurity systems, and expose people to sort of personal invasion. If technology is to serve human dignity and not harm it, and if technology is to promote peace rather than violence, then the human community must be proactive in addressing these trends. This is left extremely open by the text. It does not zero in on any of the particular ways in which violence is done to us through technology or through digital means, through the internet. This is a very broad, and again, for the first time in Vatican consideration, and so we can expect to hear much more about issues of digital violence throughout the upcoming years and decades as Rome sees fit to say more about the ongoing current events of our time. Those of you who may have watched the original explainer video that Holy Family put out last January, I suppose earlier this year, about the Vatican permission to give informal blessings to people in same-sex unions, may remember the only thing I choose to say about that particular explainer now, go back and watch it if you haven't seen it, is that the document permitting that came from the same office within the Vatican, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, overseen by and signed by the same prefect, Victor Manuel Fernandez. And when this text came out on the infinite dignity of the human person, just about 4 months later, secular media, and some Catholic media as well, liked to either pit the two texts against each other or to hold them up as a diptych. Either way, saying, well, fiducia supplicans about blessing people in same-sex relationships was clearly a reach out to the partisan Catholic left. And here, this document on human dignity that goes so hard against abortion and surrogacy and sort of classically right-wing political issues was a branch to the right side. And so it was important that the Vatican put out both of these documents, or really prioritize the dignity one after the same-sex blessings one, to continue to look like it's in the middle politically and has things to say to both sides. True though that may be in our perception here in America in the year 2024 of what left and right means in our culture and what role the Catholic Church ought to have advocating for what is true and good on both sides. True though that may be, I think it is wrong to see that kind of straddling the partisan line as being the reason why either of these texts came from Rome at the time that they did. They are both expressions of what Pope Francis has been showing us from the very beginning, from the very first interview on a plane coming back to Rome, from the very first foreign trip that he did back in 2013, that there is no person who should be denied an opportunity, who should be denied a benefit of the doubt, who should be denied recognition of their freedom, recognition of their dignity, recognition of their intendedness by God to be a person in communion with others. And that humans deserve, by virtue of being human, more than the minimum amount of consideration as such. If a person comes for an informal blessing, we don't need to put them through a rigorous interview to see whether they deserve to be said, the two of you are driving across country together, safe travels. Be well, get to know each other better on your road trip. And on the other hand, a child who was created through artificial means and put into a person who was neither of their parents to be grown and birthed and then handed back. That is a child who is being treated unfairly and not really treated as a human being with his own innate dignity. So they are two expressions of the same principle. They belong together, but they don't belong together because one speaks to the partisan left and one speaks to the partisan right. They belong together because human dignity is maximal. And we ought to consider it from every maximal angle and foster it and promote it and show in our lives and our choices that we value it as such. And with that,